Well, hello everybody. This is Scott Morrison. I'm the former CTO of Layer 7 Technologies and now a distinguished engineer over here at CA. And CA bought Layer 7, back in June. It's gone fast, but we're still doing a lot of really interesting things, innovating in the space of APIs, identity, and in particular OAuth. Listen, everybody, I got to tell you, today is going to be a really good talk. And the reason is, I think, is that we've got a really great, lineup for you today. First of all, it's the topic. OAuth is incredibly timely these days. Everybody's interested in it. Everybody wants to actually be able to do some, new and innovative work with it. And this webinar in particular has broken all the records of attendance you've ever seen here at Layer 7. And that's something we're really excited about. Now, much as I wish I could take credit for it, the truth is the credit really lies with my other presenter. Mehdi Medjaoul, a lot of you know, is basically one of the real pioneers in the area of OAuth and APIs. He's a co-founder and executive director of Webshell. And rather than me introduce him, let me actually turn it over to him and let him introduce himself and give you a bit of an idea of his background, and then I'll launch in and we'll go on from there. Mehdi, take it away.
Hi Scott, hello everybody. So first, I'm really glad to be here making the webinar with you, Scott. I respect a lot of your work and what you do at Layer 7 and CA right now, and thank you for inviting us for this on this topic, which what we see is really trendy at this moment. And yes, so as you said, I'm the co-founder of Webshell, a company that makes API middleware integration. And yes, and Webshell is behind two main things in API space, which are OAuth.io, that we will make a small demo at the end of the presentation, and about API Days conference, which we make conference worldwide on APIs. Layer 7 has been many times sponsored, so thank you to support the API community like that, Scott and Layer 7 CA. And yes, and I'm really happy to have today the opportunity to talk about OAuth with you.
Great. Well, listen, what we're going to do is basically I'll launch into some of the experiences that we've had here at Layer 7 with OAuth. And the way I put this together was I really went down to the people who are in the field dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. Because it's one thing for someone like me, like a CTO, to sort of spout off all of this ivory tower stuff. But in the end, what matters is what really works. And that's what we want to try to, talk about today and put the focus on in this whole talk. So a couple little housekeeping things from the very beginning. The hashtag for today is #L7webinar. We're at Layer 7 and also at CA Inc. And Webshell, of course, is at Webshell with an underscore right there if you want to hit us all up on Twitter. Now, here's what we're going to do. Like, here's what my talk is really going to be about, my part of it. And I'm going to go for about 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to pass it off. But the real thing I want to leave you with is this really, impression of why OAuth is so important. Because a lot of people, I think, misunderstand how significant it really is, and just see it as yet another security token, which it very much isn't. And what I'll do then is kind of go into some of the more interesting scenarios that we're coming up with on a day-to-day basis. We've got a bit of a flow chart in here, so you can narrow down what the best grant type is, what makes sense for you. I want to talk about token revocation and why this is so important for some scenarios, but not for others, and how that actually impacts your architecture in that. We'll talk about some of the things we've been seeing a lot about, where tokens should reside, where you're going to put the keys to the kingdom, and why the security around that really matters a lot. And we'll talk about scope. Scope is really important, and getting your scopes down right and knowing how to leverage scopes in the 21st century is really important. And then finally, we'll talk about some real-world scenarios that we're seeing, like, literally on a day-to-day basis right now in very high volumes and high transaction rates. So some real cool stuff there. So without any further ado, let's look at the basic OAuth diagram. I mean, we've all seen this again and again and again, and this was the one that was kind of refined out of the original OAuth, 1.0a model, through RAP, and then finally into 2.0 that we're all working with now. And if you've been around identity for a while, this should look really familiar. This really looks very similar to, pretty much what we used to talk about back in the SAML days with security token services and things like that. And so a lot of people tend to look at that and be dismissive. In a sense, they say, well, you know what, this is just another security token. I've already seen it all. I've been doing sessioning for years. I've been doing SAML for years. We've done Kerberos before. What's really new here? And if you get caught up in that, if you get caught up in thinking of OAuth as just another security token, you're missing the whole point. Really, OAuth is incredibly important, not because, it's a particular token, and not necessarily even because of the exchange patterns, but because what it represents is this real shift in how we're handling identity these days. It represents this shift from moving towards this model where everything was very centralized and controlled, from a central authority, which when you think about it is the way that identity has been for, well, pretty much since the beginning of computer identity, where this cabal of, directory or identity and access management engineers sort of held the keys to everything. And if you needed, as a developer, anything done, you kind of had to go up and fill out forms in triplicate and ask them really nicely, and maybe in 6 weeks it would get done. OAuth really represents a big fundamental shift, where really what we're doing is starting to give responsibility out to the users themselves for things like tying accounts together or making decisions about what kind of access they're willing to grant to their own accounts or even potentially different parties. And it's actually really profound because it's actually really empowering not just to all of us, the developers who are dealing with that, but also the users themselves. And really it's the secret to scale, because the problem with so many of our systems in the past, the problem with what we've been doing with trying to scale by doing centralized identity and access management really hasn't worked very well. So in the modern world, in the 21st century, we're moving much more towards this idea where all of a sudden the users are becoming important, the users are becoming empowered. And that's a theme we see basically covering a lot of these new technologies, whether it's OAuth, whether it's OpenID Connect, and whether it's some of the more exotic things that are on the horizon but are going to be very important, like UMA, which is coming out of the Cantera initiative. So keep this in mind, because this is really the fundamental idea here that's so important. So let me start off, first of all, with kind of a flow chart, because this is something that, I sat down with Sasha Previch, who's one of our engineers here, who's one of our local OAuth experts, and I was asking him, Sasha, what do you see when you talk to our customers? Like what do you need to drill down on in OAuth because they're misunderstanding things, they just don't get it. And he actually came up with a really neat flow chart. So credit where credit's due. This is Sasha's stuff here. And the flow chart just kind of takes you through a couple of quick questions that nail down what kind of grant type you're really looking for. And this is obviously fundamental to so much of what OAuth is about, is really understanding, in particular with OAuth 2, obviously, what you should be converging on. Because there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction that, OAuth's always going to be, something simple like authorization code with traditional three-legged OAuth. But in fact, you need to understand the grant types well and the different approaches to flow. And this is kind of a neat way that Sasha's come up with, with nailing that. So the first question is, do you need to authenticate the end user? And it's a pretty simple question, but it sort of gets people thinking again about what are you really trying to do? Is this an application just accessing some kind of information like config information or audits or something like that, in which case it's not really about the end user. It's actually about app-to-app communication. Or is this really about, trying to harvest some kind of, authentication, but also some kind of consent from an actual end user, from a human on the other end of it? Obviously, if the answer is no, you can just go to the quick client credentials grant type. Or sorry, if the answer is yes. I'm sorry, I flipped that one around. But if the answer is no and you've got a human on the other end of that, you can then ask another really important question. Oh, it looks like I skipped over two. Excuse me for a second. I moved a little too fast there. And then ask yourself this, or ask the user this: do you actually control those credentials or not? A real simple question, but it really gets people talking about the fundamental ideas here. Very often, what we're finding with OAuth is people are kind of colluding it with the whole social login thing when they don't necessarily need to. Social login, of course, was a tremendously powerful thing that was enabled by OAuth, and it's something we really want to make use of. But the other thing that you got to consider is it's very, very relevant for internal users as well, and places where your app and your authorization server fundamentally are connected up maybe with your legacy identity and access management system, or even just something as simple as your LDAP directory. So if you control those credentials, really you can just dive right into something like password grant type. If you don't control those user credentials necessarily, look at this, I've got some finger trouble here on my slide advance. You're into that sort of social login scenario, and then it's important to ask if clients can keep secrets. So sorry about the bad slide advance, it's making things a little confusing here, but really it is just a sort of a 3-point decision graph here. And if they can keep secrets, then you're into that classic, kind of, 3-legged OAuth flow that we see again and again. And this is the classic authorization code grant type. If they can't, then we're into something a little different. And then we get into that implicit flow with a response type token. And these are usually JavaScript clients, okay? These are usually, served up by you as a web app. And people very often stop and they, oh yeah, we can keep shared secrets there. We're just going to obfuscate them or hide them in JavaScript somewhere. But the truth is that stuff's really easy to re-engineer and get access to. So, as Sasha says, this becomes one of those sort of crux questions that's actually a lot deeper than it sounds. And it will often cause people to really drill down and start to, question what they thought they knew and start to, understand what's really going on. So after this, we start to get into some questions about scale. And scale is really, really important because when you think about what scale you're trying to deal with, obviously your architecture is going to fall out of that. And when we talk about scale in OAuth, what's interesting is we're talking about a couple of big things. One of them is big scale for us is starting to be thousands and thousands of validated transactions a second up against the APIs that are actually being, accessed with either access tokens or what have you. And obviously you get a lower volume on your authorization servers. But at the same time, the authorization servers have to worry about, literally millions of active sessions. So they're keeping a lot of state and a lot of information together. And so the scaling aspects of these two things, the authorization server and the protected resource server, are really some things to consider, pretty deeply. And this isn't, stuff we're just making up. This is stuff that we're really seeing in the field these days. And in fact, we've got one, sort of deal in flow right now where people are talking about literally tens of millions of active sessions. They want to keep them around for quite a while. Yeah, they want to, basically have maybe short, short timeouts on access tokens, but they want to actually keep sessions open so they can just refresh those pretty continuously for a long, long period of time. So their big open window is pretty big, and they really want to keep history together because the history is something they're actually using to make risk and even scope decisions. So more on this later. So OAuth, you can tell, is mature now because it's hitting these like incredibly high volume sort of scenarios, and it isn't really science fiction stuff anymore. So the next question to start to ask yourself about, which really drives so much of what your architecture is going to look like, gets into token validation and whether you're going to revoke stuff or not. Because remember that your tokens, whether it's access tokens or refresh tokens, really do have this lifetime. And the big question is, are you going to have to cut this short at any time? Like, could things go bad? Could things go sour in such a way that you want an administrator to go in there and start, blowing away sort of open sessions? So, invalidating refresh tokens and even potentially access tokens. If it's a no, okay, if you don't have to worry about that, your life just got a hell of a lot easier because all of a sudden you don't really have to worry quite as much about, the depth of central validation. And you'll see this in a moment in some of the architectural diagrams. If you really want to be able to cut off active access tokens and stuff, all of a sudden you've got a tougher problem, and you've got to deal with some more interesting issues. So let's look into those. Let's say you've got a no revocation case. So imagine this is, look in the upper right there, and imagine this is your simple architecture there. You got a firewall in front, and down the lower part of it, this kind of 4 stacked servers. Imagine those are your APIs, okay? Those are your API servers. You got a lot of those over there. And you've got an authorization server right next to that. And so the authorization server isn't going to take a lot of traffic there. Really that's where you're going to go for your initial, token setup and all of that. What you can do here, and what a trick is that we can borrow from, the SAML world, is actually the authorization server doesn't really necessarily have to be called on every single validation in this case. Because remember, you're not worrying about token revocation here. So it can actually throw out an authorization token and a refresh token, bundle it all up into a nice little, signed JOT or something like that. And encapsulate enough information so the resource servers can then really look at that and just make a decision on their own without having to go back to a central authority again. Now, obviously, that's got limitations because you have to have, your timeouts and everything like that. You have to have a trust model here. You have to have signing, no question. But really, it looks an awful lot like distributed SAML at this point. And you knew that was going to happen because, there was a lot of good stuff in SAML with all the bad. But this can make for very, very fast, very lean architectures. But they have a problem. They have a problem in that, ultimately, if you want to revoke, you can't. You can't easily revoke because you've got all these distributed systems all over the place. So the other thing, if you have to revoke, you're going to be on your protected resource servers, on your APIs, you're going to be calling back into that sort of central authority and saying, hey, I got an access token here. Is this thing still good? Yeah, I've maybe looked at it from the point of view of trust and everything like that, but is this thing still valid from the perspective of right now, right this minute? So this kind of gets into like the same problems we had with certificates, where we had to go to central CRLs or use OSCP and things like that to do online validations. And so obviously we've got much, much bigger scaling issues now. Obviously we need an incredibly scalable database that we have to worry about. And we need a security model really for, holding on to those tokens. And so more on that in a little while. But the thing you got to think about here is what your exposure is and what the relative risk and reward is, which balances that greater complexity if you want to do revocation in your architecture, with what you could be losing. So if you got no revocation, really you can start to get into this thing where your exposure is really really only as good as the window of a particular access token. So let's say you're throwing these things out for 10 minutes or so. Really you got a 10-minute window that you got to worry about, because if somebody hijacks that bearer token or something like that and tries to start reusing that, you've really got that timeout before that token is really pretty much dead. And that person's got to go back, get a new refresh token, use a refresh token, kind of get a new token all over again. And that you can control much more easily on your authorization server. If you're doing revocation, of course, you can start to cut that off because you're constantly going back to a central source saying, hey, is this good, is this good, is this good? But also bear in mind that most architectures are not going to go back on every single call. One of the things that we try to do a lot, with our customers is sort of, tune this risk profile so that even on those calls back to the central authority, you can start to, do caching and things like that. So you're not hitting that central server all the time, Now, your tolerance to caching really defines that sort of extra time that you've got to manage. And this gets into one of those questions where you've really got to ask yourself hard, what's my risk model? Like what am I willing to put up with to sort of get some of the benefits of caching? Because caching, as we all know, is computer scientists and things like that, is where all the great, wins in terms of performance have always been. That's not changing. It's the same with this scenario as well. So we just have to sort of dial up or dial down our risk reward here and try to deal with that. So the next thing we got to ask ourselves is, okay, revocation, we'll deal with all that, and that has influences on our architecture. The other thing that has influences on our architecture is where tokens reside. Because again, tokens are the keys to the kingdom. I mean, you're giving something out, you're giving this bearer token out, where you're basically saying, anybody who's got this thing it represents, in effect, a session. I know people don't like to talk about it like that, but in effect, it's an open session. And so these are the keys to a lot of little, kingdoms for a lot of different people. And so protecting these things is really, really important. A lot of people will just kind of keep these things locally, because it's easy. They'll keep them in the DMZ because then all the other, API servers that may have to validate against those can actually access that really easily. We generally say to that, don't do it. For the same reason you don't want to keep like your LDAP directory in the DMZ. You don't want to keep the keys to the kingdom, even if they're only temporary, in an area that could potentially be attacked or easily compromised. So this gets into an interesting scenario because you're starting to take this session information and starting to tease it out and move it into another tier. And that tier, generally should be in a secure area, which means you're getting into some interesting problems. I mean, you could just throw in any kind of DB there, and you know, you've got the whole question of how do I scale that? Like if I'm hitting that all the time and validating against that, what's my scaling model going to be? And you know, I'm not going to give you advice there because there's smarter people than me that have, you know, thought these things through. We see a lot of relational databases here still. We see a lot of people using, you know, like big Oracle Iron or big IBM Iron, and you know, despite the whole NoSQL movement, you can still get surprisingly good scaling out of, you know, these kinds of solutions. You know, they're proven, you know, they're very robust, and they're very reliable. We're also seeing more and more movement, obviously, towards NoSQL style solutions. You know, we're seeing some really interesting stuff being done with Cassandra, because you can get like automatic timeout on objects and stuff like that, which is really awesome. It just makes your life a lot easier. And you know, we also see a lot of just, you know, raw database access like this. Obviously, you have to think about token maintenance and stuff like that, like, you know, aging tokens if you know, through, you know, cron job or something if you're on a relational database system. You know, less so obviously if you're in Cassandra and you can take advantage of some of the, you know, native capabilities to time stuff out there. We're also seeing, though, you know, some interesting cases where the database itself is being fronted by another tier. Okay, so you're actually putting an API up in front of that. We like this a lot at Layer 7. We think this is really good because it gives you, again, you know, a little more capabilities around managing access into these things. You can do threat detection on it, you know, and you can also start to actually leverage capabilities that we see in, you know, other related technologies. You know, we see people using OpenID Connect, for instance, and just like a user info query on this to actually validate, you know, the integrity of an OAuth access token. And that's actually kind of neat because it you know, it's within the scope and within the spirit, I think, of stuff like user info. We also see some just, you know, home devised, plain vanilla, you know, query APIs. And I think that's fine too, because the truth is you're in a bit of a closed ecosystem here. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about interoperability. So it is okay to, you know, sort of roll your own here, and do a real, you know, sort of strong separation of tiers here. Now, scope in OAuth is something that, you know, a lot of people kind of misunderstand how powerful it is. You know, and scope is really something that, you know, when you think about it, you're attaching scope to a particular access token, you know, based on privileges. And one of the things that we're seeing that I think is so interesting right now is scope being used for differentiated access. So different scopes being applied to access tokens, you know, from the same endpoint really, but based on different privileges of a user or even different sort of context of a user authentication event. So it gets really, really interesting there because, you know, people are coming up with scenarios where, for instance, the scope may be different based on whether this is resulting from an initial authentication or, let's say, a subsequent refresh. So in other words, let's say you get an like an access token and a refresh token from, you know, right from an initial authentication and you know, sort of consent ceremony. And you use it for a little while, and then all of a sudden your access token's gone, you know, it's expired, so you go back with your refresh token. You get back another access token, but the scope is now changed on this access token because it's considered, in a sense, a little more stale, a little more old. It has history to it. And you can do some interesting things there because you can start to implement some kind of continuous authentication models, which is a really important model that's coming out in security these days, where you're not just saying, okay, you're authenticated, great, you know, here's your session handle or whatever, go to it, do whatever you want, just, you know, it's good for forever or for a certain amount of time. Instead, what you're saying is all transactions are potentially, you know, ready to be reconsidered, ready to be sort of stepped up, if you will, to say, you know what, something doesn't feel right in this transaction. The flow is a little wrong. The flow has too much history. It's getting a little stale. Let's kind of go back and ask another question. Now for humans, that's pretty easy. It's kind of like all of a sudden you can throw up a page that says, hey, you know, I just want to check a little more, like sort of like the credit card company does with your credit card. You know, just there's some risk here potentially. So what we want to do is maybe ask you some more questions. Now, we as humans, we might get irritated, but we can probably deal with that. Obviously, in API to API, you know, transaction to transaction, app to app communication, it's a little harder to deal with there. But with creative use of scopes, you can begin to start to manage this kind of thing. And this is why scope is so important. This is why scope is really key to, really modern use of OAuth, because this is how we communicate between clients and servers, what the sort of the value of what you can do with a particular access token is. And that could change all the time. I had a really interesting discussion, actually, with some really bright guys just yesterday, actually, down in the Midwest, about some scenarios where they're looking at, step-up authentication. So in other words, different authentications based on, different uses of a particular API and, based on a user, an application, and, all kinds of other context. It really got me thinking on the way home, on a long flight home from the Midwest, about how scope could be used in these scenarios. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how important scope really is in these kinds of scenarios and how well suited it is. My good friend Eve Mailer, who's a Forrester analyst, talks about the importance of this kind of thing all the time. And, she talks about this idea of the sort of the identity singularity coming up, where all of a sudden we get this these fantastic uses of identity in that, based on these capabilities that we've built into these basic models. And it's an interesting idea, because I think we are in this kind of golden age of interesting uses of identity from just some simple answers that have come to us from OAuth and OpenID Connect and related technologies like that. Now, consent is another one that again, is really, really important. And it's been very black and white in the past, where you just basically say, this is what you got. And it's very server driven. And really, it is the responsibility of the OAuth provider and the API provider to figure out what that consent expression is and map that effectively to the scopes. This is a real new frontier. We haven't quite figured this one out. It's right now it's real black and white. Like, are you willing to let application foo access Twitter, your Twitter account, to post tweets, and that's it. But I think in the future we're going to see a lot more sophisticated stuff. And so keep an eye on things like, well, technologies like UMA and things like that. And some other related technologies as well, where the user gets more say. The user gets more say in customization, and that's going to be a real holy grail that you want to keep your eyes out for. So I'm running a bit over time, so I'm just going to show you two quick scenarios that we see all the time. So I'm throwing in. I'm trying to keep this as vendor neutral as possible here, but let me show you a couple of scenarios where our Layer 7 gateways are being used. And I'm just throwing them in simply because it's a common scenario for us. So we have a gateway solution that sits in front of APIs, but it can also do all the heavy lifting for OAuth. Both is a gateway in front of an API, obviously, in dealing with access tokens, but it can also operate as an authorization server really well, and we do that a lot, like tons and tons. And one of the things that we do with the authorization server, obviously, is interact with legacy IAM systems, like whether it's everything from an Oracle Access Manager system to just a plain vanilla LDAP directory to Active Directory to something really sophisticated like CA SiteMinder. And what we can do is put in effect an OAuth veneer, an OAuth facade on top of this stuff, and do the token management so that from the perspective of, let's say, a developer building client app, they just see OAuth and they just see plain vanilla flows, and grant types, whatever it is, authorization code or whatever. Very, very simple. And they don't have to worry about the fact that there's Kerberos in the back, or there's X509 certificates or SAML or something like that. So this kind of mapping, this kind of kind of brokering in the background is something that's really, really interesting. Now we do this on kind of an enterprise basis, but when Mehdi takes over, he's going to talk about like the big picture of this kind of OAuth brokering, and that's what they do at OAuth.io, which is super cool, which is creating consistent user experience, like developer experience, regardless of what the back end OAuth is, and that's a really, really important thing. So I'll leave him to talk about that. The other one that we're seeing a lot of is use of existing web apps and web sign-on pages within the OAuth flows. So in other words, using redirects to go to, like, let's say a legacy series of web pages which have been around for a bunch of years that really people want to reuse an OAuth, but they don't want to, you know, re-instrument all of those back-end web systems and stuff like that to do the OAuth consent and to deal with giving out tokens and that. And this is actually really cool because it really does a good logical separation between consent and authentication. And it fits really well. It's done with redirects and stuff like that. You know, there's some interesting stuff in the security model between the redirects that always has to work out. You always have to map some kind of, you know, token, whether it's, you know, a SiteMinder token or even something, you know, different like a, you know, a proprietary session token or something like that. You know, because you need that trust model. You need provability that the client went over there and got authenticated properly. But there's ways of doing that. So I think this is really cool because this is less of you know, a facade and a proxy, and much more of like almost like a federation on that. So cool stuff here, and this kind of stuff really excites me. So, you know, in summary, you can always tell that a technology is mature because people are pushing the envelope. And what I think is cool about OAuth is that it's open enough that you really can push the envelope. The problem, of course, with that is it's a double-edged sword. It also means that there's a lot of different implementations and stuff like that out there. And so that's actually a good segue into some of the other issues of interop and that, and the second part of this. So without any further ado, what I want to do is pass this off to Mehdi and let him begin to talk about what they're seeing and what kind of things come up in the other part of OAuth in the real world. So thanks, everybody, and Mehdi, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Scott. I hope everybody hear me well. From you know, Scott, you've made a great architecture description how to scale with OAuth. We will try. I will try with our experience of OAuth. I used to give the developer perspective, so the outside, the outer the firewall perspective when they want to integrate OAuth, and it can be enterprise developers, so your own enterprise developers that want to integrate your own OAuth. It can be partners from developers from partners companies that wants to integrate your OAuth, or it can be long tail developers that wants to integrate your public API OAuth. So, and I will share with you this developer perspective. So, just to tell you, with OAuth.io, that's the Webshell powers, we support 4,000 applications. So I will share you the feedback that we have. Sorry, there is a seems turn again on your mic. Okay, it seems that the sound is quite bad. I can try like that. I will try like that. So we have 4,000 applications. So, and we have a lot of feedback about developer paying using integrating API. So my first question today is: are you getting the maximum from OAuth? And why we say that is because often in kind of authentication models, we have 3 players, so one identity provider or data provider, one entity consumer, which is the application, and one user. So in the case of OAuth, it's an OAuth provider, one OAuth consumer, so the application, and the user. And the thing, what we see, and what is, in my opinion, what is the reason because OAuth has a great business value. It's, for example, do you know the Candy Crush application? You can play without a Facebook account or with a Facebook account, and the experience as user will be completely different. So by the fact that Facebook, the OAuth providers, had kind of interested the application to implement it on OAuth, so the user has a different experience and a better value experience. It can be with Dropbox, for example. So the Pro On Go application is the application, Dropbox is the provider, and you are the users to go to the service. But the thing is, in a classic way, so the 3 legs are completely similar and have the same power. But what we see with OAuth is that the value is concentrating the value is really concentrating to the OAuth providers and to the OAuth consumer. So the OAuth providers own the data because we already have the user. The OAuth consumer choose the identity, choose the OAuth he wanted to have a user experience for his user. For example, Candy Crush, it says, okay, if you log in with your Facebook identity, so you will have a better experience. You will be able to share with friends, to see the friends who they are in the game, and try to beat them. So the user with OAuth has more decision. He can have more scopes to decide where he can accept or not. But the value is really concentrated to the OAuth providers, who has an ecosystem of applications, and the application can choose the identity or can oblige the user to use the service of the provider. So the business value is quite concentrated mostly on the OAuth providers and the OAuth consumers. And this is where, as a company, you may want to use OAuth, is to concentrate the business value on your side to become the platform of application and manage data and authorization and identity for your ecosystem. So this is where there is the value and why OAuth is important to look at. So really short story about the tale of the two OAuth. So we have the first draft in 2007, which has been revised in 2009. Globally, it has signatures, so it's really secure, but it's hard to implement for developers, and it was not so flexible, no expiration of tokens, and you was not able to control the level of access that you for the user. So every user did not have the choice. You couldn't make a different user experience depending of the permission you needed. But even for that, still some providers like Twitter, Flickr, or Yahoo are using OAuth. So then we have OAuth 2, which is non-backward compatible alternative. And the main issue is that OAuth 2 has several drafts between 2010 and 2012. And because of many companies were skyrocketing at this moment, so many companies made a different implementation depending of the draft that was updated at this time. OAuth 2 is more flexible, but because of this flexibility, we had a wide range of non-interoperable implementation, and that was the main problem as a developer perspective. Even if it's less secure because it doesn't have the signature that you have obliged to check every time, it's really easier to install when you develop clients on top of the API, and that was the part of the success of OAuth 2 in the developer community. So the tale of two OAuth is maybe the tale of too many OAuth, and we will see 10 different OAuth implementations that you couldn't get. So we'll just see some tips after we will be able to talk about it in the question. But this is the main thing I wanted to share with you today, is that as developer, your OAuth is not maybe the OAuth we have implemented from another provider, and this is why it's important to really focus on making the simpler for a developer. So just the Facebook one. So when you make the Facebook dance or the Facebook protocol, you have to send parameters, and then you will receive these authorization parameters after. But when you send parameters, there is a kind of specific specs that are described. For example, Facebook, for the refresh token parameters, for the ground type refresh token one, they call it Facebook exchange token. So it's completely different. And when a developer knows the spec, knows the standard, he will be lost. So he will have to check the documentation, and because he thinks he knows how to do it, and he will find that Facebook makes it different. So and for the refresh token and with parameter refresh token is the same. It's Facebook exchange token and refresh token of parameters. Even if they're for the scope, so the notation of Facebook are quite strange and original, because you can mix underscore and dot, like friend action music. So it's kind of weird for some developers. And the separator, which would be a white space, is a comma. So sometimes many developers will lose time just by not avoiding this mistake. For Deezer is the kind of European Spotify. So they call not client ID but app ID. Scopes are now terms like permissions, and they use comma for separators like Facebook. And the state is non-documented, so hard for developers, and the response type code that you have to put in parameters is useless because they have only one brand, but you have to put it and you don't understand why. And when we discussed with the CTO of Layer, they said, why did you put comma as separators? He said, oh, because for us, our developers are Facebook developers, so Facebook is the standard. Google respects mostly the spec. They just added more parameters. They have, for example, an access type for you to be able to choose when the user clicks if you want to send a refresh token or not. They have approval prompt to force the pop-up even the user is already connected. So if you want to really be sure that the user has to put his credential, even if there is already a session running, you can use this parameter. You have login hints to prefill the email and include granted scopes to add more authorization and custom ones. So for example, but this is what developers cannot guess because it's not in the standards. Foursquare had the issue with the, when I say the 2010-2012 standardization of the OAuth 2 because many libraries try to retrieve the access token instead of OAuth token. So Foursquare did the last implementation of token, but and they say in their documentation that okay, maybe you should care about access token or token because you may have some mistakes, and Foursquare has no scope. So it's kind of, it can be weird for developers that are used to use scope. Salesforce, which is really business API, but it has maybe a lot of different things that are not standard. They have other parameters, so immediate. So it's because Salesforce asks the pop-up every time, but immediate you can skip the credential and authorization form. Display to have a different display depending of the if you are on the web, on the mobile, or if you want a small pop-up that appear. You have a login hint as Google to prefill an email or prompts for if you ask for reauthorization or reapproval each time for connecting to the service. And Salesforce adds more things because when you have the authorization that comes back, so at the return, you have instance URL, and it's kind of really original because it seems that Salesforce doesn't have URL only on api.salesforce.com. Depending on where you are on the world, Europe and US and other considerations, they send you another URL where you have to make your call. So it's really different, and developers, we see a lot of developers that are lost because of that. Salesforce gives you back in the answer a signature to verify the identity URL that it was not modified. Developers are not used to that. Salesforce gives you an issued app instead of expires in. So you have to check in the documentation and not in the answer that what is the length of the expiration token, and then you have to make the calculation yourself. So it's okay, but it makes the implementation harder. And because they support OpenID, you have to have an ID token. And just as feedback, that the UX for creating an app is quite hard. It's 4 clicks that you have to make, and it's not so easy to make an app. So another example is VK. VK is Russian Facebook. You can set up. They added one parameter that is we've seen only this in the 100 OAuth version that we have implemented. They have you have to put the version of the API in the parameters. So okay, you have to know that. And authorization return a user ID. It's also original. So instead of access token and then /user/me question mark access token equal, now you have one more thing to put in the answer, which is user ID, and then in the URL you have to put it just before the question mark access token. It's completely we didn't know why they did that. It's completely original, and but as developer you have to find it yourself, and you can lose many hours and days just because this kind of mistake. To go fast because there is so many different implementations that 23andMe is just a small one, but you can spend few hours to fight with it. So it's the scope are with columns. So they use columns to differentiate the scope. So it's not usual. Tencent Weibo, which is the kind of Chinese Twitter. So it was really hard because everything is in Chinese. But they have an extra parameter which you have to put, and it doesn't work if you don't do it. It is OAuth version 2.8. So the 2.8 doesn't exist, but you have to put it in the parameters. And and you can spend many hours just by not knowing that. And even if it's another language, the English, it's really hard. And just as a small tip, that for OAuth 1, you may have an English documentation, but not for OAuth 2. I don't know why. They believed OAuth 2 was simpler, but yeah, you still need English. And this was just non-exhaustive. because there is many different implementation. As developer, we see, and that makes OAuth broken, and as OAuth like a fragmentation on the web that is really painful today. So this is all the API call authorizations that can be different, even the HTTP authorization headers that can be different from providers. So the scope we've seen with Facebook, different ones. It should be a white space, but it can be a comma, semicolon, colon, even a type, which is what we have seen. Even the state parameter, it's for some API it's inexistent, so you have to put it into the callback, but you have to know it. It's sometimes undocumented, so you have to guess how it works, and sometimes it's impossible because the callback is kind of static and you cannot change it. So now you have problems, really high problems for integration. So what I wanted to push today is what you should not tell yourself about OAuth. The first one is if you are going to put OAuth in your company, so don't think that OAuth is not too hard to understand. So 2 days ago, it was the 1st of April. So we made an April Fool on our blog, which was introducing OAuth 3, version 3. And we were saying something really crazy. It's like a zero token paradigm, no more secret key, everything's public, so something completely crazy. And the huge majority did not understand. A lot of people emailed us, say we want to know more. A lot of people retweeted, and it was kind of obvious. So we had to put April Fool on the title to be sure that everybody understands. But even our users did not understand it well. So your OAuth, don't expect it simple to understand. The second one that you may say, it will be easier to do it in a non-standard way. In the specific non-standard way that you thought, for example, you may think that white space is not so well designed. It's better to put colon or something. I don't know. But the thing is, even if you're right in a design perspective, third-party developers will be lost because other providers did it wrong before you, and there is so many implementations. So the solution for us is to try to go with the standards, because you have the standard with yourself. So you will be able to have less support, but you will have whatever the implementation you do. And the third thing I wanted to share is sometimes you say, okay, we are different, it's really original, but developers just have to read our documentation, everything is explained. But the thing is often when we say in a design perspective, documentation is a bug, not a feature. Of course, every time I say that, a lot of people shout out. But the thing is, of course, documentation is really important, even in a technical space that we are. But the thing is that people should know how to implement it without going to your documentation. If there was a standard, okay, they would implement it without documentation. Documentation is the most important, but in a design perspective, it should be the last place where you go find the information to be sure that everything works, and you go in the documentation when things doesn't work. So just put an example. Of course, I know it's hard in a technical space to push this idea, but when you open a door or close the door, if you have to learn if it's push or pull, so it's documentation. So it's in a design perspective, it's a bug, not a feature. So just to share you this, the most you respect the standards, the most people will be more ready to integrate your OAuth instead of going to your documentation and just check if it's a comma or a white space or a question mark or some small details like that. So, and this is why I add that devils in the details. So in the last 2 minutes, I wanted to show a little about OAuth.io. The thing is, because we're open source, so the thing is that you can decide or not the way you want to implement it. But the thing is, because of all these different implementations, we've gathered more than 100 providers, and we completely unify them. So for a developer perspective, so to retrieve your token, just have to register, click on the OAuth provider, share your credential, and click on try. So that's it. Instead of having to implement the OAuth then as an OAuth consumer, so as the application builder. So it's really easy to retrieve the token, even if it's OAuth 1, OAuth 2, whatever the spec, whatever the version. So this is what we try to implement to make it really easy and not to break the developer experience. What we see often is developers that go on your documentation, then go on Google to find a way to implement it, then try many libraries, try to run Stack Overflow, and coming back then to us to implement the OAuth. So we try to avoid all this journey just to make it really simple to use. For generating the pop-up or the redirection, it's the same code for the 100 providers. You just have to initialize the key and put OAuth.popup, Facebook, same for Twitter, same for Salesforce, and it can be the same for your company if you contribute to the open source daemon that we have. So it will be really easy for external providers or you or internal provider. For deeper API calls, so we have a method that enables you to call any API calls in a really easy way. And so whatever it's OAuth 1 or 2, but you will not need to call your own server and sign the API request. No more access token management to make it really lighter to call APIs after the OAuth part. So this is the thing. We support web and mobile. We have mobile SDK, and for the last thing, we are open source. So we have an OAuth daemon that is called OAuthD that you can implement on premises to consume whatever OAuth and even yours. It's on GitHub, and you have to fill a 10 JSON line to contribute to put your OAuth into it and make OAuth easy for every developer on the earth, whatever it's out of your company or inside your company. Thank you, Layer 7, for joining. I think I've put it 22 minutes. And thank you, and we're ready for questions.
Hey, thanks a lot, Mehdi. That was great, and you know, I think you really showed a lot of the issues in OAuth right now around interoperability and inconsistency in that, and that's sort of to be expected with one of these kind of new emerging standards, which has a lot of room for interpretation, and I think it calls in a lot of ways for the need for technologies like what you guys are doing at OAuth.io, just kind of broker between different providers, but also fundamentally the need to profile and sort of nail down at least consistent approaches. So a couple of good questions. I had one actually earlier on, specifically about, is it possible to do token revocation as a developer? Is there a standard interface to it? And presumably that's like as a client-side developer. And the answer, unfortunately, is no. It's a great idea because there's times when it would be great to be able to go in there and just say, this token is dead. Let's completely shut all this down. But there's not a good standard approach to that yet, and that's why it hasn't shown up in a lot of the other locations. The other question, any idea if Twitter is going to support OAuth 2 soon? I don't know about that. Actually, I haven't heard anything. Mehdi, have you got...
So with API's conference, we are close to a lot of providers, and I know that it's in the mindset, but I'm not aware of something in implementation, but I know that sometimes because of all the issue that they have with OAuth 1 implementation and all the support that they have, so many support questions, they are considering ways to make it simpler. So it can be using OAuth.io or going into OAuth 2 or whatever. But the thing, yes, they take it in consideration to make it simpler.
Good. And I think last, because we're going to have to wrap this one up, is it easy to add OAuth into the Layer 7 policy? And obviously this is coming from somebody who's done some work with Layer 7 and that. The answer is yes. We have something called the OAuth Toolkit, which is part of our mobile application, or sorry, our MAG or mobile application gateway, and we're using that for all sorts of different interesting OAuth implementations, and a lot of the time I'd love to tell people the details in that, but very often they're confidential within a particular company or customer or whatever. But suffice to say, there's some really interesting stuff going on that we're seeing, and that's been the input to a lot of this whole talk. So listen, everybody, I think, we've probably got to cut it off there. Much appreciate your time. This, I mentioned earlier that, this webinar actually broke all of our attendance records, not just by a bit, but by a lot. So obviously there's a real interest in this technology, a real interest in what Webshell is doing, and hopefully an interest also in some of the other solutions out there. So thank you everybody for attending. If you want to listen to this again later, you'll get a link shortly that'll basically give you access to this webinar so you can play it again, share it with your friends, point them to it as well. We want this to be part of the community. Ultimately, OAuth is a community-driven idea, and that's what makes it so powerful. So we want whatever we can do to be contributed back into the community and foster everything from interoperability to just a continued use of this great technology. So thanks everybody, and I hope the rest of your day goes well.
Yeah, thank you everybody. Thank you.